I want to thank you for coming out. I know everyone has a busy day today. So a little history and who we are. Bresslergroup was founded in about 1970 by Peter Bressler. It was founded as Designs for Medicine. So from the very beginning, we were a product development group focusing on medical product design. And to this day, and really throughout our history, we've been roughly 30 to 40% of what we do is medical products. So we do a lot of consumer products as well, industrial, through a whole broad range of categories. Currently, the staff is about 60 design professionals. We're based in downtown and Center City, Philadelphia. About 2/3 roughly of the group is engineering, mechanical and electrical engineering, with design, research, and interaction design. And you'll get a little taste of some of those aspects today. A couple of the metrics that we use to just to measure our performance year to year. One is design awards. We're recipients of over 100 design awards from such things as IDEA, medical product design awards, appliance design, and so forth. And the other metric is patents. Across the company, we've co-authored about over 200 patents for our clients. We position ourselves as a research-driven product innovation lab, and you'll get a little taste of the research-driven side, I think, in the talk today. And we deliver unique, surprising solutions to complex product development challenges. And if you have hard problems that you're looking to solve from a technical, research, or interaction point of view, that's where I think we really shine. We have 5 disciplines under one roof: user research, industrial design, interaction design, mechanical, and electrical engineering.
With that, we'll get started on the core content of the presentation. We're going to go over a few different topics. The first being 3 trends that we, since we work in both consumer and the medical spaces, we see some trends that overlap, and we'll discuss those, as well as 3 best practices that you can take away from that, as well as 3 takeaways from the HFES conference that Conall and some of his research team attended this year. So just by way of introduction, we do quite a bit of work in the consumer space, connected devices, applications, as well as work in the medical space. And I think what this does is it gives us a good perspective to help understand where these are cross-pollinating, where there's opportunity for that cross-pollination, and what one might learn from the other. And that's, I think, what some of the things we'll be talking about today we'll touch on. So starting off with the 3 trends. The first, obviously, our relationship with technology is shifting. We used to work with technology as a very explicit task that we were doing. Now they're everywhere. They're around us. We use them every day. They're in our pockets. Sensors, beacons, AI, VR, all of this stuff is becoming ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And our relationship with that technology is changing. And I think that's something that really impacts how product development moves forward. Understanding how the human-machine relationship has changed as technology increases. It used to be that our technology was purely a tool, something that we used. We told it what to do all the time, and it was very much a tool, and we were responsible for making all the decisions. But as it becomes more complex, more connected, and able to perform functions better than we are in many cases, it gets to a point where the machines are making some decisions, and the people who develop those machines and program those machines are responsible for determining how they work and how they make the decisions that they are making, and when it's appropriate and when it's not. So it becomes a lot more complicated as the technology gets so much more powerful. A couple of years ago at South by Southwest, I saw a talk by Astro Teller, who was then leading the Google X project, which developed the self-driving car, which is now Waymo. And he was describing that in the early tests, they would send Google employees back and forth to work in these cars. And they were supposed to basically act as a backup system if the car wasn't doing something that it was supposed to be doing. So they were supposed to pay attention. They were sitting behind the wheel, and they would have to take the wheel if anything bad happened. And what they quickly found, because obviously they were monitoring inside these vehicles, was that as soon as it seemed like the cars were doing the job that they were supposed to be doing, people quickly stopped paying attention. They started texting, they started doing other things, and they were quite simply not a reliable backup system. So it just goes to show you that even though a user or someone might be consciously aware that they're supposed to be paying attention to something and overseeing technology, it's very easy for us to become comfortable and to assume that the technology is going to be doing just fine on its own. And it's something that we've seen in developing other products. One was a coffee maker, a fancy coffee maker, one that had quite a few sensors and capabilities, but it didn't have every sensor. It wasn't able to detect everything that a user might do in terms of emptying the old grounds or filling the water or doing a couple of other things. And so initially the interface that we designed was very kind of step-by-step, telling the user to do this and to do that. But what we found was that when we did that, users assumed that that the device was going to sense everything, and that they didn't need to take the cognitive burden onto themselves to think about what they were doing and to actually think about the steps of the process themselves. They quickly assumed that since it was understanding these things, it's probably understanding all of the things. And then they were getting through the workflows without actually completing critical steps because it was that instantaneous for them to just shift that cognitive burden over to the machine and make those assumptions when perhaps in that case they weren't true. So our second trend is that consumer design's influence on healthcare is accelerating. Obviously, we all use cell phones, mobile phones every day, smartphones. And that daily and constant use of technology, of interfaces, creates a very strong expectation in people's minds. And this is something that 10 years ago was not really an issue. But in terms of the types of interaction patterns that we're used to interacting with, iconography that we recognize that's commonly accepted, navigation models, natural language, connectivity, responsiveness, all of our expectations around the interfaces that we're going to be using are, unfortunately for us as people who are developing products, they start with our mobile devices, and that's a very high level of expectation. But it's something that needs to be considered, and it's something that's starting to have an effect. And so those are a few things from the actual design side of things. But then from the process side of things, I think we're learning a lot from the consumer space as well. The consumer space has the luxury of being a lot less risk averse, able to take risks, iterate, fail. Often fail fast is what the mantra is. And in the medical space, that's not always easy to do. You can't just be failing with people. But the processes that are starting to come about are starting to be adopted in the medical space as well. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from that space. And finally, hardware and UI design are becoming differentiators as the marketplace becomes more crowded with competition, and as people's expectations around their hardware and their UI design are ever higher because of the devices that they use every day. It's starting to become more of a purchasing decision and more of a factor and more of a differentiator in the healthcare space. So trend number 3 is that medical is adapting more rapidly than ever before. And to the extent that we're able to, we're embracing new technologies, adopting some of these common UI patterns and iconography, gesture-based interaction, getting in on early prototyping and rapid iteration. And Conall, I'll let you talk about some of the FDA.
Sure. So just to jump in for a little bit, we were just talking right before we got up here to share with you about the relationship with FDA and where the focus on user research and human factors came from in the medical space. And I'm maybe one of few, but I'm very grateful that FDA came down hard in this space and is enforcing their requirements that you prove that your device is safe and effective. But even FDA tells us that's not the end of the story. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we jump in to sort of what's beyond FDA, they've made it pretty clear, and I would say that the relationship is still kind of evolving. Like every time we go to a conference, they have a slightly more informed take on what the conversation should be with them, what the proof and the burden of proof should be. And I guess I'm stunned to say, but they're actually like really reasonable about it. They're quite logical and willing to have open conversation. And really what we've learned is that they're looking for everyone to get a better understanding of what user research is and to be able to make qualitative arguments that essentially say, yes, we can sleep at night because our device is safe and effective, and we've done this effort to prove that. So a couple of the things that they're specifically looking for that I think most people understand, and certainly BD is a more sophisticated client of ours in terms of your approach to this, is making sure you define your critical tasks for safe and effective use with a key understanding of all those different user groups. Ron Kay was a huge proponent of this idea that you need to step away from probability. With a lot of the testing that's done on medical devices, it's about numbers. You're doing a lot of lab testing. Your expectation is that you need to prove beyond doubt using statistical arguments, whereas when you're talking about users, that's simply impractical. And so it's not about stats. It's about each individual problem being addressed and understanding that you've done as much as the current state of affairs. Personally, my expectation is that this is going to evolve and become more and more rigorous over time. Probably the number of users is going to be expected to increase, and we're going to have to get more clever and nimble about how do we, frankly, afford the resources to prove that more and more. But right now, they're very clear about the fact that they're expecting qualitative and less quantitative arguments. And I like to tell customers who are really starting in this space that what they're looking for is a story. They're looking for a story that starts with a product idea that's based on a user need and ends with proof that the use is safe and effective. And what that means is you have to show them where you started. You have to show them how your understanding of the users evolved through your formative testing. And although that's not necessarily a requirement for a submission, you just need to show that you validated it. How do you tell a complete story? If you start with, hey, we think this is the story, and then, oh yeah, it turns out we were right. That throws up some red flags because they feel like you maybe didn't dig hard enough, because who could possibly know all the usability issues for any device, whether it's a simple syringe or a very complicated infusion pump. So really the way I like to help people who are new to the space understand it is when you go to FDA with a submission, it needs to be a story that declares, yes, we are confident in safe and effective use, and here's why. And all of those chunks underneath it are sort of the subplots and the subchapters in that story. Yeah, go ahead.
So if you, can you comment if you have a, let's say a mobile app that's more or less logging information from your medical device? And I think the FDA is clear that it's up to their discretion to, have oversight over that kind of app. Do you see them also asking for formative, summative, and in terms of critical tasks, if all you're doing is like initially pairing and then just having data sent up at some frequency, what are critical tasks, right?
It's a great question, and so we don't get a ton into sort of the relationship between human factors and risk management in this presentation, but that's foundationally where it all needs to come back to. Your risk management process needs to assess whether any of these are critical, and if you're just saying, okay, it's just collecting data and that data is going to go into a back-end database and regardless of what happens to it, patient harm couldn't result, that's a good argument for why you wouldn't need to include it. But where it gets tricky, and this is touching back to what Bill was talking about, is people adapt to that. So if you say that's the understanding, you kind of need to show that that's actually how people are going to use it, because if people expect that the back-end system's going to be catching errors, for example, and I'm not sure exactly what example you're talking about, but you need to assess it from that perspective of how is behavior going to shift based on the existence of these sensors and capabilities, and is it introducing new risks? Thank you.
So on to some best practices. What have we started to think about doing based on all of this? Obviously, understanding user types and environments is something that we all, do, right? But when I say user types in this context, I'm thinking more in terms of how the user is using the system, the types of users that are common across all products or most products. In terms of, you got your first-time user, someone who's coming to a system for the first time, may have some expertise, varying levels of expertise in varying things, depends on how similar, what they're using is to other things. But there are needs that the first-time user has in terms of being able to understand how to use the system, how intuitive is it, what kind of coaching or training or first-time experience should this user have in order to understand how to use the system. Then we've got novice users. And depending on how simple or complex the system is that you're talking about, there's some overlap here. But a novice user maybe they're not a first-time user, but maybe they're just starting out and aren't completely familiar with the system yet and may still need some help getting their tasks completed, making sure they're not doing things improperly. Then there are infrequent users. So if you're developing a product for someone who's not going to use it very frequently, then it's almost as though you're designing it for someone who's a first-time user or a novice user every single time. So you need to understand that someone uses something, kind of learns how to use it, steps away for a couple weeks or months, comes back to it, they're not going to remember. So that's something to consider as well. And then there are power users, people who are using a system all the time, and they don't care how easy it is to learn at that point. They want it to be fast and efficient. And a lot of times what we see is, especially between a first-time or a novice user and a power user, there's a big difference in what those users need from the system. So you need to really carefully consider those users and how you're going to design a first-time experience or a novice experience that's going to help that user get through. But then also consider the power user. And if it needs to be, a different mode of use, a different way of using it for these two users, then that's what it needs to be. But I think a lot of times emphasis gets put on first-time or novice users, especially when you're doing usability testing. A lot of times people are coming in and using something for the first time, a system that they're not familiar with, and it's very easy to point things out like, well, they didn't understand how to use this or they didn't understand how to use that. It's more difficult to understand how someone who's using a system every day very quickly, an expert user, how the system can be made better for them. And then, of course, you've got peripheral users. Management may have different needs depending on the system you're talking about. And patients and family are also something that we're starting to see more consideration around, especially around alarms and displays and everything that's in a patient's room, everything the patient or their family are exposed to can have an emotional impact. It can make them feel freaked out, maybe unnecessarily. So there are considerations to be made there as well. So as I discussed, you need to basically balance those needs for those different user types. Often one of the things that we do is a specific onboarding experience. When you do have a graphical user interface to help basically put that together, it's an advantage. This is an example of something for a scanner, a touchscreen scanner for document scanning. We created a pretty robust first-time user experience that instead of giving generic tips, it actually walked the user through doing their first scan. And it was very well received, and it's a great way to introduce somebody to a new product with a quick win. But then, of course, it gets out of the way. And this is something that came from mobile applications. Sort of started to see them with every time you download a new app, you get a little bit of a coaching session, or here's what's new, or here's how to use this. And so it's something that can be useful specifically for novice or infrequent users. And sometimes we'll design for infrequent users a walkthrough type interface. So someone, rather than expecting them to input all the information and what they need, you basically walk them through very simply. Okay, first you need to do this. Now you need to do this. Using illustrations, using lights, using sound, to basically just walk the person through what they need to do, because often their focus is divided among a lot of different activities. And then, versatile products lead to diverse use environments. Where this is really, there are so many factors to be considered. Is it something that's very isolated? There are very few people, a very large area. You really need to consider your worst case environment. How much noise is there? What else is going on? And I think that's worth saying twice. What else is going on? What else is the user thinking about? What else is happening? What are they doing? Oftentimes people will be doing and managing multiple things at once. So it's really important to understand that environment and what else the users are doing. Leading into that is combining the digital and the physical. So as these technologies become more complex, the workflows can become more complex. And just like I was referring to, understanding all of what's going on, I come from a software development background, designing UX for e-commerce and software, desktop software originally, and then mobile software. And all of those environments are dedicated environments. Someone is sitting down at a computer to do something. And so there wasn't a whole lot of thinking to be done about what else is the person doing or what's going on around them physically. But now that we've got, a mixture of digital and physical elements, and we've got them all around us, there's often a lot going on. And when we're designing a product that has both physical and digital components, whether it's a physical device with a mobile application or a device with UI controls or touchscreen display or anything like that, we like to think both in digital and physical kind of along the same path and map those out together. And we call them digital physical workflows. And this is an example of one for basically this was a cartridge-based lab for newborns. So basically newborns can have all sorts of issues that need to be tested for. Historically, it's involved a number of blood samples and then sending it off to the lab. The idea behind this device was that you'd take one blood sample, you'd enter it into the cartridge. The cartridge was specifically designed to test for 2 or 3 different conditions. And you stick it in the machine and you hit go. And rather than sending it off to a lab, it was meant to sit right in the nursery and be utilized by the nurses. So it had a touch screen and it had all these physical elements, and it had other things that were going on. So you've got to deal with the cartridge, you've got to deal with a blood sample, you're scanning and matching the cartridge to the sample, you're scanning the sample. So there are a lot of different things going on, and mapping out the digital and physical paths in parallel really helps to understand and create a digital user interface that's going to support the physical workflow. Because a lot of times there's not a whole lot you can do to overhaul the entire physical workflow. Those things need to be done. How can the interface support rather than kind of distract from that process? And so that's something that's become really key for us. And then finally, users first, users last. I'll let Conall do some talking here.
So no surprise, the user researcher here says users first and users last. We like to look at the product development workflow sort of in the, call it what you want, a water flow model, a V model, whatever it is. You start with a user need and you need to validate to that at the end. And in order to be sure you're making the right product and it's driven by something that your intended users are actually needing, frankly, I think that's the only process that makes sense. What that means, practically speaking, is it's time to invest in doing more of the upfront research than we're typically used to. And some of the stuff that's a little bit harder to justify budget-wise, because you don't say we have a product we need to go test and FDA is demanding it. You're saying we need to go learn what people out there want. And it might not align with what we were planning to make already or what the smart people in this room already think should be made. And that's a bit uncomfortable. And it's expensive too, because these are the kinds of tests where you're going to multiple locations, you're spending a long time observing people doing things, interviewing them, and I can tell from experience you always get invaluable data from it, but it's a bit of a harder sell because you can't say we're going to come back and show 30 people either did or didn't use this acceptably. It's not the kind of data that people are used to on the back end. That said, it's the perfect example of the textbook way you're supposed to do this research. We've done some great work. The image here is actually from some research we did for BD, going into people's homes and sharing their lives with them for a few hours per person. And these were all diabetics who were using insulin products, and we were looking for what are the problems today.
And when it comes to requirements and how we define them, it's always worth mentioning, all of these requirements that often get handed to us, right? Oftentimes it's, well, here's what the display size is, here's what the technology we're going to be using is, before we've even necessarily done a lot of talking to the user and understand the users well enough and the workflows well enough to determine, is that going to work? So, there will always be cost and technology constraints and other things that need to be dealt with. But user requirements, user experience requirements should really inform these decisions up front, or at least be a consideration when it comes time to say, are these requirements acceptable? Do these work for our users? So it's always good to keep that open and don't fix those requirements down too early before you understand what your user needs are.
So before I jump into HFES, one example I want to give about the last slide that Bill was talking about, relating to the infusion pump research we've done. And I think it really highlights a lot of the main takeaway from this. So if nothing else, this is what I would say is, everyone's cell phone, everyone carries one, and we all have these battery icons that we've gotten used to, and we sort of read them in a certain way, and they tell us things. And they work extremely differently from what the battery icon on an infusion pump means. Like, worlds apart. And we talk to nurses, and people are starting to interpret the icon on the machine the way your cell phone is, because that's what you look at all the time. So orange means it's running low, and it's going to tell me how much battery is left, and I react to that in a certain way, and they're used to seeing like sort of a decreasing amount is going. And the screens that are currently on the pumps don't enable that. It's a simple LED that turns on when it's using battery. Well, that's almost the opposite intent of what we're seeing today, right? You get a note when you need to plug in, not, so it's been really eye-opening to us to talk to nurses and say, okay, if we show you this icon, how do you read it? And invariably they're reading it like a cell phone, very reasonably, but it's totally different from what they're used to using, and this is used to using for 10, 15, 20 years. So it brings up a really challenging question if you're introducing the next generation of a product people are really used to. What's the better answer, to go with the product they're used to using every day because it's on their cell phone, or their legacy information about how the icon on this product has worked for the last decade? And frankly, I don't have an easy answer to that. That's where you need to go out and test to see what's going to bring less risk to your users. So I know that Rachel presented on the takeaways from HFES already. We had the pleasure of meeting her and a number of your colleagues at HFES this year. I hope my takeaways are a little bit different from yours, so at least it's not repetitive. I'm sure she did a much better job of thoroughly downloading from the whole process, but we'll jump through it. So this was in New Orleans. They always do a good job of picking fun places, so a lot of people will come. A few days down there never hurts. The first big takeaway we got is, sort of a lot of people talking about how do we avoid this repeat of summative studies. We all know summative is the big expensive study, and we'd really like to only do that once and do it right. And from what we were talking about, you've already implemented a lot of the takeaways, but the first one is mitigate the risk. So you want to come out of your summative study saying, we had these user needs, we show that people meet their needs safely and effectively, we're not adding any increased harm or risk of harm. Invariably, you'll still learn something. That's the whole nature of user testing. There's always something unpredictable, but you want it to be something that you can understand and rationally justify why you don't need to change the product. And it's not the attitude you want to go into. If it needs to be changed, it needs to be changed. But your hope is you've mitigated that risk. So again, where it comes down to the hard discussion is how many formative tests do we need to do? And frankly, it's as many as it takes until you're comfortable that when you start your summative testing, you're only going to need to run it once. And sometimes that's one, if it's a very simple product, and sometimes it's 5. Again, just use the infusion pump example, where we've already run 4 pre-formative tests, and we've got another 4 formative tests planned this year and next year to ensure that we're going through all the workflows. It's obviously a highly complex product, but there are huge scopes of work to be done here, and you'd rather do that earlier and get those big problems out of the way with just the 4 or 5 or 8 users before you scale up to 15. The other thing that, again, I've heard you do quite well is initiate the conversation with FDA. So one of the reasons I love these conferences is FDA shows up, they make it a habit, and they make it a point to be very accessible and easy to talk to. And in my opinion, they make it easy to talk to them sort of off the record. Sometimes there's kind of awkward questions you want to ask FDA, but you don't necessarily want to be BD asking FDA. So you can meet with them in the hallway and say, hey, if someone had a question like this, what would you think about that? And actually, they want to have that conversation because they understand you have so much weight on your shoulders when you go to regulatory bodies as a company like BD. The startups have the advantage that they don't have a reputation and they don't have a product line that could be ruined by a bad interaction. And that's reasonable, right? So how can you get that access? How can you have those conversations to sort of de-risk your approach before you even have those formal conversations? And then they also have very organized pre-formative, pre-summative pathways for you to converse with them. They want you to be having that conversation. Like I said, I have not a ton of experience working with other regulatory bodies, but I think the FDA makes it extremely easy for us to converse with them and very encouraging of us to converse with them. The second big takeaway for me was you're not alone. So I worked for a medical device manufacturer before Bresslergroup, and oftentimes you face these really uncomfortable questions. And it's kind of awkward, and there's not really a clear path. You can't just Google, like, what's the answer to this usability question? And I think these conferences are a great opportunity to go and sort of hear other people are facing the same challenges. You hear big companies as big as your company that are saying, hey, we don't know what to do here either. Somewhat that's just reassuring, but also you can get good ideas. So a few of the challenges that were talked about here that I heard multiple manufacturers talking about and may not have the clearest answers quite yet, but at least the conversation's going, is gaining access to healthcare institutions. We have a challenge today. FDA says we need to prove that our devices are safe and effective. They're supposed to be used in hospitals in many cases, but hospitals don't really want people showing up and doing research there because they have to protect their patients' HIPAA. Okay, so how do we mitigate those two? The government's telling the hospitals one thing and telling us another thing, and we need to work together, and that's a challenge. And people have come up with some really creative solutions to this. There are opportunities to find partners who work with this. One that we're embracing right now is finding hospitals who have internal innovation groups and engaging them as partners. They understand research and they can facilitate that access. And we're going down this direction on a number of projects right now, but even if you don't want to take that approach, just realize that this is a challenge a lot of people are facing, and there are firms that can help with that. Recruiting participants with rare diseases. This is a challenge, of course, as well. Obviously, in the diabetes group, that's not usually as hard, but when you start to look at some of the biologic drugs that are also being put into your products for going to market, we just finished some research looking at people using prefilled syringes at home. So we're looking at Crohn's disease and MS and RA, and that starts to get a little harder, and then it's not too much of a stretch to even harder diseases to find. One of the recommendations that we've had success with is finding local advocacy groups and partnering with them to encourage them to bring their members, or at least advertise to their members for user research. Generally speaking, they're very excited to be part of helping the next generation, and you can position it truthfully and well so that they feel very engaged in the success of the work because they want the future to be better for everyone who's part of their group already. And the last one is a bit nuanced. It's about structuring differentiation tasks. So I was a little taken aback that this came up as such a challenge, but numerous people talked about this. So one of the things you need to prove is that people not only can use our product, but they can select our product correctly. And this doesn't always apply, but you imagine a lot of products that are in the hospital, they're in a row of 20 of them, or in the pharmacy, they're in a row of 6 of them. How do you make sure they take the right medication off the wall, or the right needle, or the right syringe? And the challenge here was a bit more on the technical side. How do you avoid it becoming a matching test? Because we're pretty good as humans at matching between what we saw a minute ago and what you're asking me to go find in this box. And some people say that that's not good enough because that's not real life, right? So if you're saying, okay, well, yeah, we showed that they matched it, but then if the fundamental question is, does that mean that they could find it in their real life scenario? How do you restructure those tests so that they're more realistic? Do you need to introduce delays? Do you need to introduce more of an environmental simulation so it's not just matching between this and 5 products you've given me and I know it's going to be one of these 5, that kind of thing. So how do you get clever about that? And the third one, IFUs need IFUs. So anyone who's read in instructions for use lately knows the pain here. That's the whole origin of quick start guides, right? Is to tell you how to do it without reading the IFU. It's challenging. And one thing I learned is that you're never done with an IFU. There's always a different way to interpret it, a better way to write it, a slightly, tweak the color of that arrow to make it clearer. Part of the lesson there is start testing it as early as possible. We encourage partners to get this in as early in the formative testing as they can, even if it's not laid out like it's going to go to market. Even if there's just one graphic you want to start understanding. Do people understand what this graphic means? Put it in the test. You have the patience. Why not learn early rather than come back at the end with a more developed IFU and then learn that it doesn't really line up with people's experience? And this touches a little bit to the digital physical workflow that Bill was talking about, in the sense that you get that feedback early on. Is how are they perceiving the IFU, what are they thinking about it, and how are they interacting with your device? Again, FDA would love to be part of that conversation. So they mentioned that they want to see, as part of your pre-testing submission, they're happy to look at IFUs and sort of say, hey, how does this compare? They want to look at how do you think it's going to be presented, and that can be, hey, well, it's going to be like this other device, but here's the new content. They want you to send it to them in a Word format so they can actually comment on the specific text and suggest different approaches. So very open to collaboration on that. And I recognize it's a double-edged sword how much you share with them, because it might mean more work for you, but I feel like the conversation only ends up in safer and better products for users. And one of the comments was, how do we avoid running this summative test with our IFU that's planned to go to market and then find out afterwards we need to change the IFU, and then do we need to rerun our summative testing? So if you don't believe me that it's a good idea to submit early for any other reason, I think that's a very good reason to avoid sort of invalidating potentially your summative testing by finding the IFU has to change. Even if your product doesn't, that can mean it's not valid. And the last comment, I thought this was fascinating. So I don't know if you were at this talk, Rachel, but Dr. Eric Shaver had this really interesting talk about ISO 9186-1. And this is just one example. This is not ultimately out there, but I can't tell you how many conversations I've been part of where it's like, should it be icons or should it be text? And it could apply to a button, it could apply to an IFU, where on the device you're trying to convey information. And I understand this strong push for icons because it means you don't have to translate into 35,000 different languages. I get that. But ultimately, that is a business choice and not a patient-centric one. So what he was saying is there is a paper out there, and I'm happy to send anyone the link who wants to look at it. Basically, this ISO guide says 38 symbols, and they said, let's see how people understand that. So they brought in, I think it was 86 healthcare professionals, and asked them to identify these 38 symbols. Out of the 38, what they were looking for was which of them get 85% or more recognition correctly, and of the 38, only 6 were correctly recognized. And guess what? Of those 6, 5 of them had a word in them. So you can see where the proof is. Now, again, it's just one paper. It's just one example. You can pick apart the methodology if you want. But the point is there is evidence that shows that icons aren't the right answer all the time. Even as compelling as they might be from a business or from an industrial design standpoint, that can't be the driving decision. So before we wrap up, I want to point out, I know everyone has work to get back to, so thanks so much for your time today. We did put our business cards up here on the table, so if you don't have time for anything else, if you want to swing by and just grab those, you can get in touch afterwards. That's great. And yeah, thanks again.